It is now 2:05. This is the Audits Government Efficiency Committee meeting for Tuesday, March 27th. The council member signed the chair for my distinguished colleagues of the below. And is Mr. LeBlanc scheduled to be here? Okay, we don't know if he's here or not. So we have on the agenda 3 items. Shall we begin with number 1, please?
Item number 1, controller report relative to the fiscal year 2009-2010 single audit.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Good afternoon, Matthias Farfan for the Office of the Controller. Before you have the single audit reports for the fiscal year ending 2009-10. I should start by saying in around a week we're going to be releasing the single audit reports for the fiscal year that ended in June 30th, 2011, so that'll be coming out soon. But regarding this report, and regarding all single audit reports, they're performed annually by an independent auditor. They pretty much, the purpose of the report is it's required by the federal government for entities that are receiving federal assistance.
Now, when you say single audit report, will you explain to the viewers and the listeners what a single audit report is?
It's a federal law that was passed back in the 1980s. It's the Single Audit Act, and it pretty much, before that date, any entity that was receiving federal grants, it was a hodgepodge of the way they were audited and reviewed. So back then, in order to improve and make it more efficient, they standardized the way in which all these federal awards would be audited. So they pretty much put together the requirements as far as to check to make sure people were in compliance with the grant requirements. Uniformity, yes.
Someplace else, uniformity in preparing the audit.
Yes, exactly. And that's how it came about. Now, there have been some amendments to the act that have happened a couple of times throughout the years, and that's pretty much what the auditor is using as the guide when they're performing the audit.
They're auditing multiple departments, though.
Yes, they are.
So it's not, when you say single audit, some people could interpret that as just one department or one entity auditing. How many departments?
It would be all city departments that are receiving grant funds, but for this particular year, it wasn't all of the departments.
CRA, Harbor, Housing Authority, Water and Power.
Yes. It was pretty much aging, CAO, City Attorney, CDD, Cultural Affairs, Emergency Management, Environmental Affairs, Fire Department, Housing, Mayor's Office, City Planning, Police Department, Public Works, Transportation, Library, and Recreation and Parks.
Because when you hear single audit, they think it might just be one particular department, but it's multiple, but in one unified fashion.
Yes.
Okay.
And pretty much the purpose is to give the federal government some assurance that the federal awards are being managed in the way that the grant requires them to be managed. And so pretty much for this particular audit, for the fiscal year that ended in June 30th, 2010, there was a federal awards, $540.7 million was expended during that fiscal period. There's a detailed listing of them in the report. It's called the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards, and you'll see there which federal entity granted the award and which department was administering it, and the dollar amount. Now, much of those dollars are coming to the city, and some of them are then flowing out of the city to subrecipients. So of the $540.7 million, $265.3 million went out to subrecipients. So that's also part of the audit, is that the auditor is making sure that the city, as acting as the pass-through, is also making sure that they're making sure that those subrecipients are also complying with the grant requirements.
But I understand we were not in full compliance.
We're not in full compliance. This audit pretty much had 12 findings, 3 of which were material weaknesses, which were pretty much severe in that they found we were in non-compliance with the grant requirements. And then 9 of them were significant deficiencies, which means we were in compliance with the grant, but they were severe enough. It's not as severe as the material weakness, but they're severe enough where they merit attention that they need to be corrected. Now, those items are listed in the back of the report, where pretty much the auditor listed the finding, also the cause, a recommendation, and then there's also a management response that pretty much indicates what their take is on the finding and what their plan is to rectify the finding. As I mentioned before, we are going to release the 2011 single audit in the coming week. That one, it still hasn't been finalized, but pretty much of the 12 findings that were listed in this report, 11 of them seem to have already been addressed, either partially implemented or have been fully implemented. There is one repeat finding still that's outstanding, but that'll come out when that report comes out.
And what other actions required by the department or the departments or the council to get in compliance? I mean, if we have a situation which repeats itself not in compliance, that obviously shows problems.
Yes.
So what actions required by those departments or the council to address? What do we need to do next?
Well, as I mentioned, the department's management will put out an action plan to rectify the situation. Unfortunately, this audit happens once a year, so it's a snapshot. So, of course, best case scenario, we wouldn't want to see any repeat findings year after year. So it is in the power of the council or this committee to, periodically ask departments to come back and provide an update on where they're at as far as implementing their action plan.
We want to do that with the ones that weren't in compliance, especially the one that's been repeated. We want to make sure that we get them in compliance because we jeopardize future federal funding if we don't get in compliance.
Yes.
And what are the consequences if there's non-compliance?
Well, the federal entity can pull the funding. I mean, that'd be the worst case scenario. They do use this report. We do submit it to the federal government. And occasionally those agencies will contact the city or those departments to have follow-up questions and find out what's going on. So that type of interaction does occur as a result of this report. But as I mentioned before, if something does occur, I mean, it would be coming to your committee or council, but it would already be after the fact.
Right. That's one of the issues with the audits is the audits show there's a problem, which is after the fact, and then the question is, what have we done to correct that so it doesn't recur?
Yes.
And apparently there's some issues that are recurring, and we need to make sure that we can correct those with those specific departments.
Yes.
Okay. And Simpson & Simpson, I see their name quite frequently. How many other firms do we have doing audits other than Simpson & Simpson?
Well, they're currently our external auditor for the city's financial statements and the single audit. It's an RFP we'll put out. It's usually every 3 years. We'll put out, it's usually a contract that'll be for 3 years, and it'll have an option to extend 2 times after that. We're currently in the 5th year of the contract with them, but we will be going out to RFP, I foresee, next fiscal year. And of course, all audit firms will be welcome to bid on that. But as part of that contract, it includes the audit of the city's financial statements, which is the comprehensive annual financial report. It also includes the single audit is included in there as well.
And then they, winning that bid, continually do audits during that period of time?
Yes.
Okay. Do we ever verify their accuracy?
The auditor? Well, that's just, they're certified auditors, so
well, there's been situations that have occurred recent where it wasn't happening as it should be happening, and I'm just looking to say, not to say any disparaging remarks, but do we ever verify that what we're receiving is actually what we're receiving? Because there's been some problems if you look at the big picture.
Yes.
And my concern is that obviously not to show anything negative, but to check. So normally we don't do that.
We do as part of the whole RFP process. When they're bidding, we'll check up on references to see if there's anything that's occurred. But as far as Simpson is involved, we've never heard anything from other customers that would give us pause.
Okay. All right, Mr. Rosenberg.
Yeah, I think Mr. Zine covered them, but let me just repeat two things for the record. From what I gather here, the instances of noncompliance occurred in the following programs, and this is the one ending June 30th. The Home Investment Partnership Program, the Community Development Block Grants, the Section 8 loan guarantees and nonprofit security programs, Urban Area Security Initiative. The auditing process also disclosed 9 other instances of noncompliance, which are required to be reported in accordance with the OMB circular, and which are described in the reports. This is a backdrop now. It appears that some of these instances of noncompliance have to do with staffing vacancies. 2 instances were the Community Development Department. Were these staffing vacancy budget related, and have they subsequently been remedied? Do you know about that?
Yes, as I mentioned, and an update will be provided on the audit that we'll be releasing within a week.
Right.
But as I mentioned, all of the findings have been addressed, and they're being reported by departments as being implemented. And
Okay,
there's
that's
only-
good. Now
there's
let
only
me
a
just
few-
go to the second one. Findings 10-4 and finding -5 on pages 6 and 7 of the corrective action plan indicate that LAHD failed to submit certification documents, triennial review reports, project financial statements, and fiscal inspection reports to HUD as required. Is it true that current staff are not aware of this requirement and are not aware of any previously submitted certification or reports?
Yes, that is what the department had reported. And some of this did occur, because as you recall, there was the early retirement incentive
Right.
program that took place. So these departments are fully staffed at this time, but they do have new people there. So
I
some of
see.
them weren't too familiar with, what the requirements were, but, hopefully by now they are.
So you figured the ERIP impacted that issue.
It did. It did impact it.
What are the consequences, and I know Mr. Zine asked this question as well, what are the consequences of noncompliance?
Well, as I mentioned before, worst-case scenario is that the feds could pull the grant. So
Yeah.
if we're receiving, large dollar amounts every year, they could just refuse to provide any future funding until they see that, or they feel that we're properly managing those funds.
Yeah. So to take Mr. Zine's point a little step further with the same comment, do we have best practices that then go work in there so this doesn't happen?
It does, in that the departments that do receive federal grants, they are given guidelines as far as what the requirements are of them,
Yeah.
as far as reporting to the federal government or keeping track of subrecipients. So as part of this audit, if those findings come up, then that's when the management has to then develop an implementation plan.
And do you do a follow-through with them to see that they've done that?
And no, it would only occur annually as part of the single audit.
Right.
But as I mentioned, council or your committees, could instruct those departments to report back periodically to find out where they're at as far as in implementing those plans.
Okay, my last question again. Was the city or any of the audited departments penalized in any way?
That I'm aware of, no. There's none that have been penalized yet.
Okay, thank you.
See, one of the concerns I have is the single audit's been around for a long time. You'd think that the departments would get their act together and get full compliance. What troubles me is that we've got situations, for whatever reason, it's not happening. And it could jeopardize with the federal dollars that provide many of the services that are described. So the general managers are ultimately held accountable and responsible. Is there any recommendation on the general managers and their accountability and responsibility, or is it just the fact that we note and file and move on to the next agenda?
Well, as I mentioned, the only way to hold them accountable is if they're required to come to your committee periodically to provide an update on, well, exactly what occurred that triggered the finding and what they're doing to rectify it, and just to make sure it's not a subsequent, a finding a second time, a third time, a fourth time.
See, that's my concern, is that we need to hold the general managers accountable and responsible for carrying out the responsibilities that they have. And when you see something like this, where there's been problems, and there shouldn't be problems. I mean, we're going to have an error here and there, but when you have multiple, that's a real concern that I have. So I'd like to, how about every 6 months, have these departments report to this committee on their compliance or lack of compliance. And I don't want to burden the audit responsibility, but find out if we're in compliance or not. And what I believe is the proactive aspect, that they need to step up to the plate to acknowledge yes or no, and if not, why not? And the excuse, we don't have enough personnel, there's ERIP, there's this, there's that. I got a simple answer to that. There's 7 days in a week, 24 hours in a day. I guess you have to work a little harder, because I don't go for the excuse that we don't have the personnel. That excuse has really been used up a lot. So sometimes you got to stretch your resources and make some modifications. So let's do a 6-month review on this particular subject. And if you just want to let the general managers know that we're serious about holding them accountable and responsible, and that's what this whole charter does, is hold them responsible and accountable, and I don't think that the city as a whole is doing that. And what we want to do is make sure that's done.
Okay.
So the controller's doing a fine job with it, good information, but as you see, it continues and nothing happens, and it continues, nothing happens, and hey, nobody cares. Well, this committee cares. So that'll be the direction. We'll get a 6-month review, note and file, and then note and file this information, and then a 6-month review of these. Paul?
Yeah, by non-compliant departments.
Yeah, by the non-compliant departments, and then make sure those issues are corrected.
Great.
Okay?
All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And let's go to number 2, please.
Number 2, controller reports relative to recommendations in connection with the controller's audit for citywide use of contracts for services. That was released on May 7th, 2010.
Well, don't be afraid.
Line up.
Cynthia Varela with the Controller's Office. I only hesitated because I wasn't sure if you wanted another presentation of the report. We had done that in the past, or if you just wanted an update on recommendation status.
Update on recommendations on what we've complied and what we haven't complied.
Correct.
In other words, have they gotten the message, or are they still dragging their feet?
Right, right. What would the committee prefer?
We'd prefer the latter.
Okay.
Is that okay with you, Mr.
That
Rose?
sounds great.
Okay.
Okay. In other words, we want to put the nail.
Okay. Okay. Our process is that once we issue a report, 30 days after the report is issued, we request the departments to submit an action plan to show us how they're going to implement the recommendations and give us a timeline, and we evaluate that for reasonableness. In the case of this report, we had asked the departments that were included in the review to provide an action plan. We evaluated that, and then periodically we request an updated status.
Are they complying with that?
Yes.
Okay.
So we have, for this particular report, for the departments that were included in the audit and where we had specific recommendations addressed to them, we are showing that the Board of Public Works is 100% implemented. The CAO has 2 recommendations that are not implemented. This was as of February 29th, 2012. There were recommendations directed to council. Those 2 are not implemented. ITA has 2 recommendations that are not implemented. The Department of Transportation has 1 recommendation that's in process. LAPD has 2 recommendations that are not implemented. The Mayor's Office, there were 9 recommendations directed to the Mayor's Office as far as giving instructions to general managers on implementing the recommendations. For those 9 recommendations, we're showing those as in process. And the Personnel Department had 2 recommendations they were involved with that are being shown as not implemented.
Now, why aren't they implementing?
In some cases, it's because of the date. There may be some things that have been deferred until additional information is gathered. Are there specific departments that you're interested in? And are you interested if they have not been addressed at all, or if they're in progress?
Well, in both areas.
both areas.
We're joined by Councilmember Tom LaBonge. Thank you, Mr. LaBonge.
For a number of the departments,
number
two
two.
of the recommendations actually involved multiple departments working with both LAPD and ITA on a contract that they had for their systems the idea was that eventually we would take over the ongoing maintenance and upgrades of the system. We would bring that in-house instead of having an outside contractor do
Is
that.
that the Teams 2?
Yes. And the recommendations have been pretty much put on hold in that the ability to create a new job classification, to hire that position, fill that position, and then bring those people on board, that's been put on hold because of budget issues.
Well, I was talking about LAPD. Maggie, why don't you come forward and wave the flag of success or defeat?
Good afternoon, Maggie Goodrich, LAPD. We took a look at these very seriously when the audit came about in 2010. As you're well aware, the issue is 2 years later, here we are, and in a situation where it's difficult to fill the vacancies we have, let alone come up with new city positions that we would then fill in order to replace the contractor. We were able early on to fill some of the vacancies. We filled 3 programmer vacancies early on. The problem I have is that the very talented programmers that we hire tend to let us train them, stick around for about a year, and then they go work for one of the proprietaries for more money.
Right.
And that's just the harsh reality I have. I mean, I hear you about working harder to get it done, and believe me, my staff works very hard. They're doing as much as they can. I cut the staffing of the contractor down by quite a bit over the years. I mean, we started with 19 contractors, we're down to 6. But at the end of the day, I've got to keep the lights on, and unfortunately, the contractors are really the only solution at this point until we can figure out a way to not only hire, but then keep the good employees that we do find.
Are we paying much more for the contractors than we are for the city employees?
No, when you look at the salaries versus the contract rates, it's not too much of a difference. It kind of depends on how you calculate it and if you figure in a 30-year pension and all of that. The other thing that we do find with contractors is that we don't have FLSA rules and things like that, so contractors, can work through the night or over the weekend, and we don't have overtime issues and things like that, and overtime funding we have to come up with in a lot of these fixed price contracts. So that's another area where we make up a little when we're dealing with a contractor versus a city employee. The other thing that we found is that there are a couple duties performed by contractors right now that simply can't be performed by city employees because we don't actually even have a job class within the city that encompasses some of sort of this cutting edge technology and different types of technical skills that an employee would need to have in order to even take over that job.
Okay, Mr. Rosenwald has a question.
Yeah, just on the point that my colleague was mentioning, generally speaking, is the use of outside contractors in the best economic interest of the city when you just wait it out like that?
I think it would depend on what type of position you're looking at. I think we'd have to talk in different there are different categories of technical positions. I would say that overall having a balance of both is to the benefit of the city. I think having the city employees who are ingrained in the department understand how it operates and being able to really provide sort of that business side and bring that knowledge to the project is important. But then on some of the very technical positions, I think it does make sense to have contractors who come in with very up-to-date skill sets. They continuously receive training, which is something that we don't necessarily provide the city staff because of the budget situation. So my answer is really, I think it needs to be a balance of both. I don't really think it's one or the other.
You're absolutely right. And in that conversation, do you hold a conversation with the unions to make sure everybody's clear and understands this, that it is not an issue, it's a matter of the flexibility necessary for the specific issues?
I haven't had any conversations with the union.
You haven't had any problems?
No, because we certainly have done a balance of both. Like I said, we certainly use the city employees absolutely where we can.
Yeah, and that's a very positive comment from you, and I appreciate it.
And with that, I would ask that unless there is some other specific action you would like me to take in regard to these recommendations, my suggestion is that they be closed.
Maggie, just fix it.
If you want me to just fix the budget, no problem.
What it shows here in 2009-10, the budget allocated $203 million for contractual service for non-proprietary departments and offices. I mean, $203 million is a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right.
And I know you've got great talents to fix it.
Not a problem.
I like your positive approach. So while we have these other, the police, public works, et cetera, the recommendation from the controller is how do we then bring those that aren't in compliance into compliance, which is the key that we want to do.
All right. The way that we approach it is that we do look at the responses that they give as to the reasons as to why it's not being implemented and whether that makes sense. So it's not a matter, if we have an issue with the rationale being provided not being valid, then we would certainly continue to encourage the department that they look toward, implementing the recommendations. I think even in this case, we recognize the budget issues and the constraints that the police department were facing, still trying to hopefully see if we could bring this to closure. One thing that I did want to bring out, as Councilman Rosendahl mentioned, one of the things that our general observation from this report is that the cost analysis is not required in order to contract out for these services. This was really what we were kind of getting at with this report is before doing that, you really need to know what it is, what it would cost to do in-house versus contract out. Well, and that was not required under 1022.
But it is now.
Well, we recommended that it would be.
We recommended that?
Yes.
I think that's obviously a good recommendation, and I'll leave it to the chair if he wants to move with it. I certainly could support that.
Well, along with that, the city lacks adequate internal controls to ensure staff follows contracting policies. The mayor should direct the CAO to develop an authoritative and comprehensive manual to assist departments in contracting for services. The city cannot be assured that it is more cost-effective to contract for services than use city staff. We got a lot of recommendations that seem logical. I mean, from our perspective, mayor and council should re-examine the use of $3 million Prop A funds to ensure other high-priority projects are not underfunded. Contracted program administrator was not selected through an open competitive process. I mean, it goes on and on with a lot of the issues and concerns that we have, public works, LAPD, ITA. Our concern is that we, and according to the CAO, $200 million deficit going into this next fiscal year, which we'll get the budget projection next month. But we got to be realistic at the same time, try and plug some of these holes. While the controller comes up with the audits and shows the concerns and the issues, it's incumbent upon us and council to do something to correct it, not just let it go linger from 1 year, from 9 to 10 to 10 to 11, 11 to 12, and to the end of time. So your recommendation, both of you, on how we would be able to better address these concerns that somehow don't seem to be getting the attention or the interest or the change. I don't want to put you on the hot seat, but say it like it is. Because then we'll turn to Mr. LeBonge for some other interesting information.
Well, I think the prior controller's representative had a good suggestion about asking the general managers to come up and present, what they've done in the way of these recommendations and what's holding it back.
So maybe we should bring the general managers to this committee to answer those questions. What do you think? Wouldn't that be a novel approach?
That's
like
certainly
that?
one approach.
Well, you know what? I like that approach because general managers think that oftentimes they don't have to answer to the council, they only have to answer to the mayor, but they do have to answer to the council. So why don't we recommend that these areas that we are deficient, we have those general managers, not their designee, but their general managers come before this committee, and we'll continue this matter and have them come and answer these questions. And we would ask you to come back also. And
If I
Maggie, you
may,
can come back too.
Councilmember, I would like to ask that we first have the opportunity to review these recommendations with the controller to determine which ones
Okay.
are in fact still valid and what should be closed. Like, in my opinion, the two that apply to LAPD are simply outdated by 2 years. It's not
Okay.
a reality today. The chief takes this very seriously. I take this very seriously. But to, continue for the next couple of years to talk about the same recommendations that just aren't realistic for us.
Well, if that's the
I
case, then we
think
need to
might
push
not
those
be a good
off the
use of
table
resources.
and bring the positions that we do have, the issues that we can't, because it doesn't make sense for the controller to do an audit, bring up information, and then they do another audit, bring up the same information, nothing's changed. That doesn't make sense for anyone.
Absolutely. And there are recommendations that we have implemented. Certainly the 1022 evaluations and all of that, we absolutely did implement.
So why don't we do this? Why don't we have that come to this committee with those general managers, and what Maggie has asked, that we have the controller work with the different general managers, Paul, on the issue, so we can then make sure we can make some change. Because it frustrates me to see these reports and the time, the energy that goes into it, and nothing's changed. That's what's very frustrating. We want to see the impact. And if it needs to be pushed off the table because it's old and obsolete, then so be it. But at least we get contemporary. I mean, there was a report that came out that some $500 million is owed the city, except most of it we can't collect because it's beyond the statute, which doesn't make any sense. So, you're talking about money that you can't collect anyway. We need to be contemporary with it. So we will coordinate that. We'll continue this in this committee and get those information. Mr. LeBon?
Just one thing clear. The CAO is here on this at all?
Don't think
Because all
so.
I've heard from the CAO is that we need to get less people on the general fund, period. That's the big mantra. But yet the city controller's representative gives a toss-up whether you should hire or contract?
No, what we said is that you should do a cost analysis to determine what's the best way of using limited resources. Does it make sense to contract out, or does it make sense to keep it in-house? And we're really looking at those things that are an ongoing need.
But I also think, too, there should be a standard, like if you know that Vermont Avenue is a north-south street and Wilshire's an east-west street, what costs, what employment costs are, should be as simple as the direction. I hope someone has that either in the CAO's office now, that they don't have to study. I would be shocked after these years of reorganizing city government that someone doesn't know it is less expensive or more expensive to contract out, or what is the menu on that. That also being said on this, the police department, the people of Los Angeles, I believe, truly want a Los Angeles representative who's a public employee at their door if there's a problem. But if there's services that may enhance the police departments to be more effective, I want to make sure that it's the most effective and cost efficient, as opposed to just, because you mentioned, or someone mentioned, that there's sometimes when you do have a private contractor, the rules are different so they could perform in greater speed. I think, who said that?
I said that.
You said that. So, that's the thing that we have to look at, because speed is a real important thing in this world of ours that we live in today, to serve people. So I think your suggestion, because I didn't hear it from the mayor, I didn't hear it from the CEO, but I've heard it from mayor's staff that the departments report to the mayor, period. So I think Mr. Zine's request may be worthy, Mr. Rosendahl, that
I agree.
we ask that the general managers just come and lay out what they think and believe, because it does seem different from the days that I worked for the late great John Ferraro, where there's a disconnect between some managers. Some are very accessible, but some are not. It's totally different.
The way that the charter describes a general manager appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the council. If the mayor decides the general manager is not performing to his or her expectations, dismiss, and then they can appeal to the city council. So some general managers have this attitude that we don't work for the council, we only work for the mayor.
Right.
And that's the concern I have, is that the mayor's office is responsible, we're all elected officials, responsible to the people. But I think some general managers have that, they don't have to answer to us, and that's why I want to see them come to this committee
Just
so we
explain.
can get that information, because it's supposed to be that taxpayers are paying to get the service, and we want to provide that service. So general managers deliver that service. But I've heard it from a lot of people that general managers don't really answer to the council, only answer to the mayor. And if we have to have the mayor's staff or his chief of staff come in and explain that, the bottom line is we owe the taxpayers more than what they're getting. We're trying to make that happen. So we want to thank the controller. Thank you, Maggie. And we will continue this in this committee. Bill Rosenthal?
Yeah, just a few more questions for this. Why did the audit only look at 9 contracts administered by just 4 departments?
Yeah, big question for me. The idea is that, for this type of audit, we're really looking at the processes, and so we looked at those contracts that looked, either there were a lot of amendments with the contracts, there were high-dollar contracts, that looked like there were a lot of amendments with dealing with the contracts, and also if we looked to see if maybe it was something that could be done in-house. So we keyed in on a few contracts just to see what those particulars were, and because they covered multiple departments, it's quite a task to make sure that you're up to speed on all of that.
Okay, appreciate that. Now, the last question is, we spent $203 million for 2009, 2010 on contractors. What is the budget allocation for contractual services in the current fiscal year?
I can't answer, I don't have that.
We don't have that.
We'd like that information, obviously, to know in this current year what we're spending.
Would you have that, Paul? Yeah. Okay. I don't know if the controller would have it, but probably easier getting it from the, yeah, okay. All right, thank you. So that'll be the direction on this. Thank you both very, very much. And number 3, please.
Item number 3, continued from April 26, 2011. City Controller reports relative to a performance-based audit of the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program for the Department of Water and Power.
Water and Power, don't be shy. Yeah, why don't you come up and join her? Don't leave her here by herself. There you go. She's got to have some backup now, because they got Yancey waiting back there to fire away. Okay. Let's hear from the controller. You released the performance audit, Renewable Portfolio Standard Program. And then we'll hear from Water and Power.
Okay. Cynthia Varela with the Controller's Office. This was an audit that we used one of our master agreement contractors to perform, North Star Consulting. Doug Bennett is the Managing Director of North Star, and he performed the project. Would you like a overview of the results, or?
Yeah, North Star, you built the engine for the Cadillac.
I'm sorry, there are a lot of North Stars out there.
That's the only North Star I know. Cadillac North Star engine. Okay, yeah, let's get a little overview then.
A quick overview. In the 2004-2005 timeframe, there was attention given to renewable resources for electric generation. The targets for those, for the percentage of renewable generation increased to during the period from 2004 to 2008, at which time targets were set for the DWP, and in its final analysis, the target of 20% of kilowatt hours in proportion to the overall generation was the target to be achieved by the end of calendar year 2010. We performed the audit in the spring and summer of 2010 and found that DWP was on track to achieve that 20% target. However, when there became considerable uncertainty over the funding for the Renewable Resource Program in the spring of 2010, the department throttled back, if you will, and was less aggressive in pursuing renewable projects. At mid-year, roughly mid-year, they estimated that they would achieve only 18% at the end of calendar year 2010.
And not 20%.
And not 20%. However, during the remainder of the year, considerable rainfall, snowpack, and because of the economic recession, the consumption was down on electricity a bit. And in November of 2010, the department believed that they were going to reach the 20% goal. At the end of the year, I believe they said they did. That's not an audited number, but I think their numbers should be provable by now.
So they reached the goal that you were looking for?
They did.
Okay. Even though there was a little bump in there?
They were the recipients of some good luck. However, the issue that remained was the hard connection between financial funding for the program, which is it's a very expensive program, and the acquisition of renewable resources on into the future. The ultimate goal is for the department and the state is 33% by the end of 2020.
And is it solar? Is it hydro? Is it wind, or is it a combination of all?
It's a combination of those, biomass, small hydro, not necessarily large hydro. There are a variety of applicable technologies that can be used. All of them are quite expensive.
Any nuclear?
No, nuclear is not part of it, I
Okay.
believe. Is that correct?
Nuclear is not.
Unfortunately, nuclear is not part of it.
Okay.
On that point, when you said, do we expect a rate shock if we force ourselves into this renewable, which is obviously dramatically more expensive by 2020? I mean, what are we realistically looking at?
Councilmember, rate shock implies that there would be a large bump, a significant difference from the trend.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you can expect a rate shock, but if a program has gone underfunded for some time and it's in a deficit mode as it was at the time we did the study, then a shock would not be out of mind. It would not be out of order.
Yeah. Because we might not be able to count on rain. We might not be able to count on other
This year is
angles.
going to be very difficult.
Right. So the cost of the renewables is really what we're getting down to.
Yes, sir.
Is prohibitively or potential reality that might become difficult for a customer.
35% by 2020. It's not that far away.
That's the 33% by 2020.
The state's goal is 33%. There's been a movement to align the city's goal with the state. The city's goal was 35%. So there's probably good reason for an alignment of those targets, because now the department is considered to be within the state requirements and regulations for achieving those. But in all cases, the renewable resources are greater than traditional resources for power production.
So let's hear from Water and Power. Yeah. Now that we've got a built background.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Ann Santilli, Water and Power. As North Star mentioned, we did pull back.
I like that name, Mr. North Star.
We did pull back on our renewables because we didn't have the rates in place to support them. Our energy cost adjustment factor was under collected, probably about $160 to $200 million. And for us to continue and to enter into contracts when we weren't certain that there would be rate relief in place, we felt it was prudent to hold back.
But you still made 20% though.
We still made the 20%, but there were contracts in place that the power system had identified that would be good projects if we had the ability to pay for them. They're still on our radar. We still plan to get to 20% and to comply with the state's goals. It's just a matter of, are we going to be able to pay for it going forward?
Where are we now? What percent are we now?
This is Mike Webster. I'm Assistant Director of the Power System Planning and Development Group. This year we are projecting in 2011 we will be about 19%. That we project right now that we will be at 19% this year as well.
And where are we finding the best opportunity? What type?
If you look at the future and the bids that have come in recently, solar development is looking like it is getting much more traction. And it has really tremendous benefit to the power system because we have tremendous transmission resources into the desert Southwest region, so we can use unused transmission capability with solar projects and fill that transmission up without building new transmission. So if you think about geothermal, the geothermal resource is in Imperial Valley, and we do not have transmission access there, so we have to build transmission to get there. So solar has the benefit of coming in at costs that are very attractive and hooking in with our unused transmission capability.
So solar would be number one right now. I notice a lot of homes are putting solar on, I don't know if it's because of the advertising or whether there seems to be a large number, at least in my district, driving down, see a lot of solar going up on top of residential areas.
The solar incentive program is going extremely well, and we are fully booked for the budget that we have put together for this year for commercial as well as residential. So while we had lots of discussions last year that somehow by dropping the incentive level so that more customers can participate would stop the program, we find exactly the opposite. We are getting very robust participation in solar for our customers.
And then they sell that back to the department or no?
Well, if
The excess, if they're generating excess.
Yeah, right now, if they generate more than what they can use, they bank and get a full retail credit for that. So they get a full, 12 or 13 cents, whatever their retail rate is, they get a full credit, so they get to make full use of that excess generation.
And the cost, I know, is significant, the installation, and then they get incentives from the city, the state, the feds?
Well, the incentive comes from two sources. One is it comes from all of our ratepayers through the solar incentive program. The second place of funding is through federal, the investment tax credit, which is available to them through 2016. So those are the two incentives that help buy down the cost of solar.
Okay. Mr. Beal?
Yeah, a few questions. First, when you look at Fred Pickle, who's joined the team, has he looked at this? Our auditor, our guy that we hired to be executive director of the Office of Public Accountability.
I don't think he's looked at this audit particularly, but he's looking at our overall rates and looking at our mix, and he'll probably comment on the cost that we have in our financial plans as far as renewable projects versus other types of resources.
So right now, he's getting a picture of the reality, the 19%, and does he also then appreciate the 33% by 2020? And will he be able to give us some clarity and simpleness about how these rates will change? Do you know?
I would imagine we could ask him to include that in his report.
Mm-hmm. I believe transparency is absolutely essential when it comes to the ratepayer. That's why I brought it up. Where does the DWP stand in restructuring or unbundling the energy cost adjustment factor, the Ecaf, to make it clearer for us electeds and the ratepayers as to what it actually contains?
That's an item we're working on right now, our rate restructure. That would be going to Dr. Pickle as well as to our board and look at the transparency. We're setting up different levels of work orders within our system, which was one of the recommendations of North Star, to identify the project costs on a project-by-project basis. I think when they did their audit, we could provide the details, but it took a lot of effort into pulling out different payments and recreating some worksheets for them. But we are working on that.
Okay, for DWP again, what exactly is the state legislation in progress designed to address relative to AB 32 implementation difficulties? Are other utilities experiencing similar difficulties in meeting the 33% renewable standard by 2020?
Okay, so first, the renewables question is that the state law SB 2, first extraordinary session, has passed. The CEC is the agency that's responsible for developing the regulations for us to comply with. They're in the midst of that process right now, seeking public comments so that we can know exactly how the regulations work, what we need to report moving forward. But the general requirements are very, very clear, is that between 2011 and 2013, on average, for those 3 years, we need to be at 20%. And we need to be at 20% using a variety of tools. We call them buckets. They're portfolio content categories. So bucket 1, or portfolio content 1, is a resource connected to a California Balancing Authority or in California. Bucket number 2 is a resource that is outside of California, that the energy is being delivered, but it may not be delivered in real time. It may be delivered, banked, and then sent during the next day during peak hours. And the third is unattached renewable energy credits, which the energy is generated, is accounted for in a tracking system, but you don't have to worry about the actual scheduling of the energy coming into the system. So we hit 20%, we have to comply with those bucket categories. The next milestone is in 2016. So the energy delivered in 2016 must be 25% of our sales to customers. And then the next milestone is in 2020, where we have to hit 33%. Again, different levels in each bucket at each one of those milestones.
Thank you for that. And had projects like the Pine Tree Wind Farm given the DWP any preliminary indications as to whether it is cheaper or more expensive to own our own renewable energy generated assets opposed to purchasing it on the open market?
Well, that's an interesting question, because really it depends on where the resource is located and the underlying property control. So let's talk about where it's located. If the resource is located where we have transmission and we have crews that can do the operation and maintenance of a variety of projects within a cluster zone, like in the desert Southwest, that's going to be cost effective. Layer on top of that the site control. Is that if the project also has permanent site control where we can, the city of Los Angeles will be here 100 and 200 years from now, and we'll have our renewables. So if we can control those sites and continue to repower those sites for the next 100 years, that will be a cost-effective site. Now, we also recognize that some projects are not connected directly to our grid. They're going through the CAISO, or they're going through areas that just really don't make sense for us to own and operate.
Right.
We also know some of those projects have 20 or 25 lease agreements.
Right.
So ownership of a 25-year project may not make sense for the city.
Sure.
Because you're going to have to go out and renegotiate. So if we can get that site control and have an extra transmission, those projects are cost effective. And our board has adopted a policy of the goal of about 50% owned projects versus 50% that would not be owned, just purely a power purchase agreement.
Actually, my last thing is not particularly for this audit, but just throw it at you. We own a lot of land and a lot of facilities, DWP, throughout the Southwest. A few years ago, I had asked for an audit of all of that. Somebody had said there's a good $100 million worth of assets that we don't need, that are out there or shouldn't have, or historically needed to be reviewed. Have we reviewed all of those various pieces of land we own and other assets we have to see if some of it we can shred or shed or keep or whatever? Have we done that kind of a look?
I believe recently we have done an audit of our property and how well we use it, which ones could be excess properties. I believe the audit report said that we used most of the property that we did have. From time to time, we do have auctions, especially in the Northern District up near Bishop.
Yeah.
But we could check back with the General Manager's office and provide that report.
If it's possible, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask that, because when we were first discussing it, we were told there was roughly $100 million worth of assets out there that might make more sense not to own or whatever.
Right, dispose of.
Report back on that?
Sure.
Great.
And then there's 6 findings, 10 recommendations regarding this. We talked about the 33 by 2020, but they're trying to achieve 35 by 2020. Mr. LaBonge has a couple questions, but then after that, if you can respond to the recommendations and to the findings, 6 findings and 10 recommendations, Mr. LaBonge.
Mr. Zine, your experience is, without question, one of the most in council. I want to ask you 2 questions. First, what are the 3 E's as it relates to traffic?
Sergeant, where's the sergeant arms?
They're out in another room.
Oh, okay.
Education?
No.
Okay.
Education.
Okay.
And no, engineering,
Uh-huh.
education, and enforcement.
Enforcement. Okay. What does it take to run a power company?
It takes knowledge, experience.
Right. It's real simple. Bill, this is for you, too. You could pop into the question. Alex Trebek asks either one.
It's a Q&A, Ned.
Real good. It's generation, transmission, and distribution. So
You worked for Water and Power.
I did, and I'm proud of Water and Power, but we have to always constantly get better. The first thing I would do if we were successful in getting a system up for people with solar in Los Angeles is put them on every schoolhouse, every library, every park, and reduce the cost that the city is paying DWP for the power. That's more important than individual homes.
So the school pays us for the...
Absolutely, but we should let them keep the money in their schoolhouse, but get their power on top of their solar and others. That's the initiative I hope you're working on.
We have...
But one thing you got to understand, because that's in your district and you're a leader in
So
that.
does Westfield.
We also have a situation with generation, how close the generation is to transmission, whether it could do. What are we doing with gas, natural gas? Natural gas, does the Sierra Club support natural gas, or is that too?
Is that one of the renewables?
Natural gas is not a renewable, and what we're seeing with natural gas is we're doing two things. One is we're repowering a lot of our coastal plants to comply with once-through cooling, but we're doing it in such a way that we can integrate renewables more effectively. So what we're doing is putting quick start units that can really back up a wind resource or a solar resource. So we're really getting a double win when we're looking at those repowerings. The other strategy, and we've pointed out in the 2010 Integrated Resource Plan and our 2011 update, is what are we going to do with coal-fired generation in the future, and how do we replace that? And the thought process is it really is an integrated approach to replacing coal. So you have renewables, which is a primary piece, but you also have some natural gas as a piece as well. And all of that goes to replace coal-fired generation in the future.
Well, we got coal fire out in Utah, right?
We have in Utah.
So what are we going to do in Utah? What do we plan to do in Utah? That's a big plan. How much is Intermountain? What percentage? If you're going to take a marking pin, see that bulb up there? How would you divide? How much is Intermountain? How much is Scattergood? How much is East Valley? How much is...
Out of a 7,000 megawatt system, we get about 1,200 megawatts from Utah Coal. We get about 500 megawatts from our Navajo generating station in the desert southwest. That's a coal-fired facility. And then we get another 2,300 megawatts of natural gas generation in the basin, supplemented with then the renewables that we've put in place.
In the basin, natural gas in Southern California basin?
Most of our natural gas, all of our natural gas is currently in the basin here.
But is it natural gas from the basin, or is it piped in from West Texas?
The natural gas is piped in from all through the western United States.
Right,
We
but
get
West
gas
Texas,
from
all that.
Wyoming,
Right.
parts of Utah.
And just technically, what would have happened on Sunday in Los Angeles if we relied totally on solar power?
Well,
because I think you're the head of power, Mr. Benjamin.
Yes.
He comes up with a real good word that is another key word here. Blend is important. That you have a blend of resources.
We do have a blend of resources, and if you think about a Sunday afternoon.
Like Sunday when it was raining, cats and dogs. Was it Sunday?
Yeah.
Sunday was raining. I don't know why did cats and dogs get picked on that? You know where your name is Mud came from?
No.
Dr. Mudd treated John Wilkes Booth, so there's a little history for
You know
you.
where Sigler came from?
Yeah, Mr. Sigmund. I met him. Did you ever meet him?
This is trivia
Did you ever meet
with...
him? Okay, it's not trivia.
Quebec.
It's information. It's information.
Let's talk about a sunny Sunday afternoon. Because
No, let's talk about last Sunday. What would happen last Sunday in Los Angeles? Heavy rains.
Okay, heavy rains.
Dark skies.
Our loads are going to be relatively low during that time period, especially if it's not kicking in a lot of heating load. And so we're going to back our coal-fired generation down to the minimum. We're going to actually turn off some of our natural gas plants and actually take them offline and get everything back down. Hopefully, that matches our load. And if it doesn't match our load, what we're going to do is we're going to make wholesale sales so that we meet the minimum requirements of our generating system.
This is real action. This is real time.
That is right. This is happening every
as if you're the
4
conductor
seconds. We are balancing the system every 4 seconds.
Every 4 seconds. This is very important. So I'm more of a water guy than a power guy. So this is real important on this as it goes on, because you have to have that blend. And if it's dark skies, there's no solar power.
That is exactly right.
And what you produce today, you can't put in a refrigerator or a reservoir. There's no Silver Lake power reservoir. It's a Silver Lake water reservoir, because you can store water, but power, what you produce today, you got to use today, right?
for the most part, although the
Right.
city of Los Angeles is very blessed to have our Castaic power plant,
Which is
which
a
gives
smart
us
plant.
some storage where we'll pump at night and then bring that energy down during the day.
Right, so it's fascinating, all this technical stuff, because it's very simple, and because we have that, not everybody has. Edison's no generation, transmission, distribution anymore, right?
That is correct.
They broke all that up. Is anybody else like, is Anaheim generation, transmission, distribution, or Azusa, Glendale, Burbank, right?
There are a few of us that are vertically integrated within the Southern California Public Power Authority, but it is probably the minority at this point because many of the participants have turned their transmission over to the CalISO.
Right. We want to keep ours. Thank
So,
you.
getting back to the 6 findings,
Thank
10
you.
recommendations. We got 6 findings, 10 recommendations, and if we could briefly go through those and see how we can make this work even better.
So recommendation number 1A was to establish specific RPS goals for 2020. And we believe that SB 21X clearly has established the goals for the Department of Water and Power to comply with the RPS. B is evaluate the use of relative economic advantage of tradable renewable energy credits. And we are working right now on an ordinance that we would like to propose in the next couple of months that would allow for renewable energy credits to be used for compliance, because we can use about 10% for compliance by 2020, and for that, really that 10% helps us balance. So if we have a low hydro year, it'd be great to go out and buy a renewable energy credit to make up for it. Or if it's a great hydro year, great wind year, we could maybe sell those renewable energy credits and offset some of our costs. So that is something we're working on, and we expect that the council members will have a discussion on that in the next couple of months. And 1C, we've talked about the ownership and the discussion that we've had with the Board of Water and Power Commissioners and why they've maintained that 50% because of that long-term vision of owning that land and being able to repower renewables moving forward. So the second item, and that's mine as well, establish resource cost benchmarks to be included in resource planning decisions. Now, in 2010, we did a very, very public process in the Integrated Resource Plan, and in 2011, we just updated that, and we have made all of the data available on how we're thinking about renewables. So we put in the number of megawatt hours for each year for the next 20 years of renewables, the renewables type that we expect, and the cost. So it is very, very clear in our IRP what renewables costs we have moving forward. And recommendation number 3 is continue recent efforts to improve the link between the RPS plan and the financial plan. Ann and I were talking on the way over is that now we're to the point where even when we develop a tactical plan on renewables, so we get an RFP and say, well, that solar project is great for the city, let's look at that, we will actually then let them know for their rates analysis, and they will include those projects in the rates analysis nearly in real time, so that there's a very, very strong linkage to the revenue requirement and the tactical plans as they're being developed, and quite frankly, as they change, they're being reflected in current rate plans.
And then recommendation 4 was to develop an integrated financial planning process linking the renewable portfolio standard and the integrated resource planning process with the traditional financial planning requirements to ensure our short-term and long-term solvency of renewables. And we've done that. Now with our financial planning process, we actually have some additional worksheets that go on a project-by-project basis to look at the cost, the gigawatt hours generated, and the percentage of energy that that project is going to deliver towards our goal. And prior to this, the department did respond in writing to the controller. We closed 5 of the 10 recommendations, and there was 5 that are still open. So recommendation 4 was deemed closed. Recommendation 5, review the cost of its renewable energy program on a routine basis and compare the actual cost to budget to take steps to address significant variances. We're doing that right now as part of our financial planning process. We've developed a more detailed budget, and we've created work orders that, going forward, that'll capture the actual cost so we can look on a project-by-project basis. Recommendation 6 was to manage its efforts to achieve the RPS goals as a comprehensive program and assign an RPS program manager responsible for renewable energy goals, achievement, and associated costs. So we do have an overall project manager for renewables. They just don't handle all the day-to-day activities that go into controlling those projects. Recommendation 7, assess the financial impact of funding its renewable energy projects, including the projected impact on the Ecaf balance and other rate mechanisms as part of the renewable project development and approval process. One of the things that we've done as part of our financial plan is we've included a line item as to over-under recovered balances. So right now we are under collected on the Ecaf by approximately $150 million. As we go forward, any projects that are planned to go online, we'll monitor that to see if it's going to increase our Ecaf under collection significantly or help us reduce that. And that's very visible from our financial plan now. Recommendation 8, include an Ecaf or other rate mechanism impact analysis on board packages for approval of projects over $5 million. We will be doing that. We haven't had any projects since this audit report was in place to present that, but that is something we will be doing going forward. Recommendation 9, DWP and the city should develop a cost recovery mechanism that addresses RPS costs on both a short-term and long-term basis and provides complete transparency of the costs of achieving its RPS goals. We're working on that now as part of our rates process. I'm sure Dr. Pickles will also be commenting on the components, the transparency, and that overall process. And then our last recommendation was DWP should ensure that its accounting structure in place, there is an accounting structure in place to isolate and capture all identifiable and incremental RPS costs for recovery, and all major categories should be considered. So what we're doing now is if there's an RPS project that's going online and we have to buy additional land or additional things, we're going to include the property taxes and any other associated costs as part of that project. To the extent we already own the land, we're paying the property taxes, those are almost like a sunk cost. We wouldn't charge the RPS program with that, but we do feel we're getting our arms around this recommendation. And as projects come online, we'll have to look at them, each one individually, to see what types of costs are incurred.
Controller? Point, counterpoint? Do you agree with all that?
Well, we had evaluated DWP's response to the recommendations to the audit report, and as Ann mentioned, we found that based on what they explained that they had done, that 5 of the 10 recommendations had been implemented, and 4 were in progress, and 1 was still awaiting action. So
they're moving forward.
Yes.
And not resistant to compliance?
No, they were very accepting of the recommendations in the audit.
Yeah, on Power Systems' behalf, I will say that it was actually helpful for us to identify areas where we can improve, because the renewables program is new for us, it's new for everybody in the country. As we were running as fast as we could to really transform the power system, it really helps to have someone take a look and provide concrete recommendations that we can make the program better, and that's our intent. So we appreciate the audit that was done by the controller and through North Star.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Zine? You have a very detailed website. I think it would be helpful if you put this on the website. Just say DWP listens, and has always been evolutionary and changing. I mean, sometimes it's difficult. I think there was a whole decade that we tried to find our way on this power issue. There was a belief decade 10 years ago where people were trying to find their way in the green world. Now we have a vision. And I think the Controller's Office has helped articulate some formality to that so we can be successful, I think, as we move forward. Because I think we struggled at Water and Power, talking to the city, not personally, but we struggled trying to find our way. Now you've established a way that you could try to be part of the blend that's necessary to bring reliable energy. Yeah, how many outages did we have this weekend, do you know?
How many outages?
Yeah, did we have any significant outage with the storm?
We did, I do not know the numbers,
But there were significant outages?
and they were restored very, very quickly.
Now, is it more underground because of the water, or is it above ground? Wind gets the above ground, and is this more of an
Above ground with trees actually touching lines and
touching
shorting
line,
circuits.
arcing? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So the,
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Rosendahl?
So we should put, no, I'm fine.
So what the recommendation will be is note and file. We want to thank Water and Power, thank the controller, thank the water side, the power side. Pardon me? Recommendation, Mr. Rosendahl?
He asked us to provide a report on property evaluation, so we could submit that.
Yeah, the $100 million worth of property that we can see. 150? The $1 billion property we're looking for. All right, so we'll file that, and we'll get the answer back from Mr. Rosendahl on that question. Mr. Rosendahl, anything else? Mr. LeBonge?
No, we're good.
Okay, thank you. Controller, thank you, Water Power, and this concludes our meeting.